Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here tonight. My name is Lissa Muscatine. I am one of the owners of Politics and Prose, and on behalf of my husband and co-owner, Brad Graham, who's over there, and our incredible staff of booksellers, we welcome all of you to this evening's event, which, by the way, for those of you who are not regulars here, is one of about 475 author events that we do every year. And it is part of our mission not only to bring great books to our community, but also to promote civic discourse, which is becoming, it seems, in a greater scarcity in our society. So we love to have these events where you can listen to authors and also ask them questions. So thank you for joining us. There are a couple of quick housekeeping things before we get started. Our guests will speak for about a half an hour, 20 minutes or a half an hour. After that, they'll be happy to take questions. If you have a question, if you could go to the microphone here, please do so. Please state your name at the outset. We just ask you to do that as a courtesy so people who are answering your question know who you are, or at least a little bit who you are. And then at the end of the program, if you could fold up your chairs and put them to the side of the room, that would be very helpful to our staff. And then there'll be a line forming here from this side going in this direction for a book signing at the end. So with that, the last thing I ask is that if you just please turn off your cell phones before we get started, that would be greatly appreciated. It is really delightful and a great pleasure for me and Brad and for the store to have Strobe Talbott and Kati Marton here to talk about the unquiet American Richard Holbrooke in the world. There really are no two people better suited to talk about this extraordinary, larger-than-life force of nature man, Richard Holbrooke. And I'm so glad that you're here to talk about him and to talk about the book. By the way, neither of them are strangers to the store. They both have had their own readings here in the past. I think Strobe has multiples. I was joking that he might hold the record. And of course, Richard Holbrooke was here for his book at the end of that he wrote after the Dayton Peace Accords called To End a War. There are also two people who may pop in at some point who are not going to speak tonight, but who I would like to at least mention. And if they do show up, we'll introduce them. The two editors of the book, Derek Chollet and Samantha Power. Samantha Power, as many of you know, has been one of President Obama's chief foreign policy advisors. She's a senior director at the National Security Council on multilateral affairs and human rights. And she also has a very touching essay in this book about being mentored by Richard Holbrooke. Derek was actually a colleague of mine, and I hope he does come. He's one of my favorite people and just a wonderful person to work with. He and I had offices at the opposite end of a very short hallway at the Office of Policy Planning at the State Department for the first couple years of the Obama administration. And I believe it was Derek who insisted that it was time for me to finally turn over a draft, a very unpolished draft, I might add, of a speech that I had written for Secretary of Clinton before a NATO event that dealing with Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now, I was a very experienced speechwriter, had worked in the Clinton administration for many years, and I knew Richard. I had been in meetings with him, and I had worked with him kind of on the fringes of some of what he had done. But I had never actually had to deliver a written work to him for judgment. And so knowing that he was widely referred to as the bulldozer, I approached this task with a fair amount of trepidation, and but kind of steeled myself and gave him the draft. And of course, I was prepared for the antics and fireworks and oh my God, this is the worst thing I've ever written. But what I quickly discovered was that there was no better person in the world to read a speech. And I really started realizing Richard Holbrooke thinks in speeches. And he was my favorite person to have read a speech thereafter, and I was very, very fortunate to be able to work with him, not just on that particular speech, but on several subsequent ones while I was in the State Department. Derek and Samantha, and with a lot of input, and I think this was really a collaborative conception of this book between Kati and Strobe and Samantha and Derek, and it came to be because after Richard passed away last December, there was this outpouring about him, and everybody was trading stories. And as I said, he was a force of nature, so there were many stories to go around. And they conceived of putting together a collection of essays written by people who knew him well. There are 12 essays in the book, as well as some of his writings from many decades. And those are fascinating to read. When you go back and see what Richard Holbrooke was thinking at the time about Vietnam, for example, and subsequent foreign policy things, it's quite extraordinary to look at in retrospect, and really, really well worth reading. Let me move on to the people you really want to hear from, which are Strobe and Kati. Strobe, of course, is the president of the Brookings Institution. He's a former deputy secretary of state. He was a obviously very highly regarded journalist at Time magazine. And I thought it was interesting, I was thinking about this today, that both you and Richard have managed to fuse your journalistic skills and sensibilities with your diplomatic skills and sensibilities to really extraordinary effect. Kind of amazingly to see these two guys who bring all of these things together in the way that they go about their lives and their work. He was, of course, a friend and intellectual sparring partner of Richard Holbrooke's. I hope maybe he will tell the trampoline story, but in case he doesn't, it's in the book, so you might want to leave it for the book, then they have to buy the book and read the story. But thank you so much for being here, Strobe. And Kati Marton is, of course, a journalist, exceptional journalist in her own right. It's in her genes. Her parents were both reporters in their native country of Hungary. They were jailed, falsely accused and jailed right before the revolution. Right after the revolution, they came to this country. She went on to become a reporter at NPR and ABC News. She also has been the head of the Committee to Protect Journalists. And I think it's fair to say that Kati has been a major force behind her husband's accomplishments. They were married in 1995 at the worst part of the Balkan War. And one of the things I read in this book is that during the Dayton Peace Accord meetings, she was assigned to sit between Slobodan Milosevic and his Bosnian counterpart, and her orders from Holbrooke were, make them talk to each other. And I gather that Derek's wife, Brooke Shear, was also given a similar mandate at a different dinner. I'm sorry, what did I say? Oh, I'm sorry, Strobe's. Sorry, they did not change wives. Strobe's wife, as far as I know. I mean, in Washington, you never know, but evidently they really didn't. So, sorry about that. Yes, Brooke was assigned to similar thing. And I also, you may not know that Richard also went to Hillary Clinton a little before this to get her ear so that she could draw attention to Bosnia during her husband's administration. So I just want to say that it did occur to me that when Richard wanted to get things done, he knew who to turn to, the women. So anyway, Kati has provided a marvelous introduction to the book in her words that's wonderful. And I just want to end and introduce them with one quote from the last line of the preface to the book, which is written by Derek and Samantha. And they say, Holbrooke may never have been a quiet man, but he was the first to say that in love, he was a very lucky man. And with that, please join me in welcoming Strobe Talbott and Kati Marton.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and it's a pleasure to be back at my favorite bookstore. I think this is my 5th event here. I've written 7 books, and 5 of them have been launched here. So I am just delighted that Politics and Prose has just gone on to greater heights, greater strengths under these wonderful new owners, and thank you all for coming out this evening to hear Strobe and I talk about our beloved Richard. I think between the two of us, we cover the personal and the professional Holbrooke, but it would take more than 2 of us to really penetrate every corner of this voracious mind and this devouring personality who has left all of us changed. Shortly after Richard passed away, and it will be unbelievably a year in 3 weeks, I reflected on an interview that I had made with Lady Bird Johnson for my book on presidential marriages, in which she said, "Lyndon stretched me." And that's absolutely what Richard did for me. He stretched me. He left me quite transformed. And in some ways, I didn't realize that until he left. That